We saw pepper spray being deployed at least 3 times. 2 people were arrested, at least 2 people. And it was just like this, just chasing, ICE was chasing people down the street. It was very, very chaotic.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. So we've been seeing these protests outside of an ICE detention center in New Jersey over allegations of improper care and hunger strikes inside, which DHS is denying. We want to take a closer look at that. Plus, is there a deal or is there no deal? We're going to talk about the mixed signals about peace negotiations coming out of Iran and the White House. And then Team USA World Cup roster, it is out. But do not worry if you don't recognize any of the names. We've got you on that. All right, so protesters and lawmakers have been demonstrating for days outside of the Delaney Hall Immigration Detention Center in Newark, New Jersey. They are alleging that ICE detainees are being served inedible food and they're not receiving proper medical care. There are even reports of a hunger strike. But in a statement to NBC News, the Department of Homeland Security has denied that. And in a post on X, DHS also denied the allegation of quote unquote subprime conditions inside the center. So understandably, we have got a lot of questions about what is really happening inside of this detention center. And for that, I want to bring in Checkey Beckford, a senior reporter for NBC New York. Hi, Checkey.
Hey, Yasmin.
So you've been covering these protests in New Jersey for days now. What has been happening there, and what have people told you?
So we've had a large number of protesters who've gathered in front of this immigration detention facility, privately run immigration detention hall called Delaney Hall in Newark, New Jersey. And the numbers on Monday were pretty large, probably because it was a holiday. And they basically have set up camp there. And their main thing is to block the entrance and exit to that hall. They want to block transports because they say they don't want detainees to be taken from there to another facility and possibly, as they put it, disappeared. They say this is something that happened to the person who began that hunger strike, Martin Hernandez, that he was basically charged with assault on Sunday night. That's according to DHS, and then transported to the Elizabeth facility. So protesters have been now blocking the entrance and exit, trying to stop vehicles from entering and leaving the facility, whether or not that's putting their bodies in front of the exit or basically going dumpster diving. We've seen taking things from the dumpster there and blocking it to do that. And so yesterday, actually the day before yesterday, it came to a flashpoint where they were blocking an armored vehicle trying to leave the facility, and ICE agents basically opened pepper spray on the group, and people were sent running, and it was a whole situation. And then yesterday, things escalated even more. We were there practically all day, and they had, scuffles every now and then. DHS seemed to have put out officers in front of the entrance yesterday. I guess they were planning for this, how to combat the protesters. And so they put officers, we saw about 24 of them, 24 of them, in front of the facility. And their job obviously is to move the crowd out of the way so that the vehicles can enter and leave.
Get back! Back!
And so constant tussles between ICE and those protesters were going on. And then around 7:30 last night, between 7:30 and 8:30, within an hour that we were there, we saw pepper spray being deployed at least 3 times. 2 people were arrested, at least 2 people. And it was just like this, just chasing, ICE was chasing people down the street. It was very, very chaotic.
That's exactly the word I was going to use, it sounds like it was incredibly chaotic. What are the allegations that are being made about the conditions inside this facility?
Well, honestly, people don't know exactly what's going on. What we're hearing is from protesters, and we heard from Congressman Rob Menendez, who was in there yesterday, but he said that was a pre-scheduled visit to speak to people about legal representation, and they were put into sort of a library, so they weren't able to freely roam the facility to see what was happening. The last time that lawmakers had been in there was Saturday, we're told, Senator Andy Kim and Congressman Rob Menendez, and they described what they heard from detainees there, that there was a pregnant woman who says that she's not getting proper OBGYN care. They said that they didn't have access to sanitary pads for a woman who is menstruating. And also a woman who had suffered a miscarriage also said that she didn't have proper follow-up care. Now, of course, DHS adamantly denies all of this, saying that every single detainee has access to medical care 24 hours a day, to food, to communication. There's also, of course, claims that they're not being allowed to speak to their families or to their legal representation. But again, DHS saying that's simply not true.
So lack of proper medical care are part of these allegations. I'm also hearing about, as I mentioned earlier, inedible food, like worms being found in food. Have you heard about that as well?
I haven't heard about the worms, but I've heard about the water conditions. Yesterday, we started hearing from the group outside. And these are a number of different organizations, nonprofits that have come out, and they've been in contact. They said somehow with people inside, and they say that the water, because people have been on a hunger strike. Detainees have been on a hunger strike. The only thing that they've been taking in has been water. And they said all of a sudden yesterday, it seemed that the water was somehow contaminated, that it tasted bad. It didn't taste normal. And so they weren't even able to do that. And so that they're concerned about what are they going to be able to take in.
So let's go with that for a moment, because DHS told NBC News that there is not a hunger strike at this facility at Delaney Hall. But lawyers for the detainees, and what you're telling us as well in your reporting, is that there is, in fact, a hunger strike. But on Tuesday, White House border czar Tom Homan said on Fox News, if there is a hunger strike, he will not let it happen.
Look, I've done this since 1984. Hunger strikes never work. We're not going to change what we do because someone goes on a hunger strike. As a matter of fact, if it gets bad enough and the physicians feel like they're putting themselves in extreme danger, medical danger, then we'll force feed them. We'll get a court order and force feed them. Hunger strikes do not work.
What is the objective of this hunger strike if, in fact, that's what's happening?
And one thing to point out, too, you noted that DHS has been denying this hunger strike is taking place all along, but it seemed last night that Homan acknowledged that it was happening. It seemed that's what he was doing. There's also, though, for the hunger strike itself, people who are the detainees and the supporters outside say that this is happening because of those kind of deplorable conditions, and that they're hoping that people will be able to have better conditions inside after this hunger strike, or as a result of it. But the protesters and people that have been in contact with these detainees say that simply it's one of those situations that they're being waited out, basically, that they're given these bad conditions so that they will voluntarily deport themselves. One thing to make clear about the Delaney Hall facility is that none of the people in there have any criminal records.
Any expectations of what's supposed to happen in the next few days?
Well, I know I'm headed back to Delaney Hall this evening. I do the 11 o'clock, and so I'll be back there this evening. And it's hard. It's hard to know. You know, sometimes it's just sitting there and waiting, and everything's kind of calm. And there's an impromptu jam session that pops up. Somebody's walking around handing out snacks, and it's a kumbaya type of feel. And then all of a sudden, it sort of just blows up. So it's hard to know what exactly is going to happen. It seemed like there was a lot of dedication by the people who were, or the protesters who were there, to keep returning day after day. And I guess as more as this kind of gets, the more publicity this gets, we're seeing more people online, influencers saying that they're going to be showing up as well. So will it get bigger than it is right now? Will we see more sort of confrontations between ICE and protesters? That's left to be seen.
Checkey, Beckford, thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin.
So Iranian state media says it got this draft of a deal between the U.S. and Iran. Now, according to the report, the U.S. would drop its naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and in exchange, Iran would reopen the strait to commercial traffic. The White House says the report is a, quote, complete fabrication. So who's telling the truth here? The Trump administration insists that some sort of deal is close, even if it's not that one. But at the same time, NBC News reports that the Defense Department has developed a list of additional targets just in case the president decides to restart combat operations. So for this, I'm going to bring in our expert on combat operations, NBC News senior national security correspondent, Courtney Kube. Hey, Court.
Hi.
Okay. What is the latest on kind of this back and forth with this deal or no deal?
It's even more confusing than what you just laid out, because we just had President Trump speaking at a cabinet meeting for about an hour and a half where he took several questions that were about Iran and he muddied this even further. So what's unclear is how exactly the blockade could be eased or completely lifted as part of some sort of a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump was asked specifically if there could be some sort of an agreement for countries like Oman and perhaps Iran to monitor the strait or to have some sort of like a management over the strait. And he denied that and said no. But then he added that the U.S. would be monitoring it. So presumably that would be with continued U.S. military presence. So things like aircraft, potentially ships there. So it's really confusing how this all is going to potentially unfold. I mean, Yasmin, at this point, it's not even really clear who the White House is talking to as part of these negotiations, or how the negotiations are even unfolding. Are they speaking on the phone? Are they just passing notes back and forth or pages back and forth? Unfortunately, we don't have any more clarity on an issue that we really thought we were going to have a sense of where this was going by now, given all of the churn over the last weekend.
Any clarity on where they are with nuclear negotiations?
No, and that was another thing that the president was asked about, whether there would be sort of an preliminary deal that would extend the ceasefire, that would have some sort of an agreement that would involve the Strait of Hormuz allowing more commercial traffic through again. And then the nuclear issue would sort of be kicked down the road a little bit, or maybe part of the second or even third tier of negotiations. But he didn't even make that clear that that was going to be the case there. He just kept repeating the same thing we've heard from him and some of his senior administration officials time and time again now, and that is their assurance that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, but without pointing out exactly how they will accomplish that.
While there is this quote unquote deal making happening between Iran and the U.S. and who they're talking to and who they're not talking to, the U.S. has also reportedly developed this list of potential targets that they would go for if, in fact, they were to resume combat operations. What do we know about this list? What do we know about the targets, especially considering the fact that the president has repeatedly said he, in fact, and the United States has, in fact, essentially destroyed Iran's military infrastructure?
Yeah, and he repeated that again today, saying that Iran has no navy, they have no air force, that much of their main military has been destroyed. Now, President Trump is right that the conventional Iranian military took a lot of hits throughout the course of the 37 or so days of that war. The Iranian surface navy, so sort of their main large ships, yeah, a lot of them were taken out. The Air Force, much of it was grounded. Many of their ballistic missiles, the stockpiles specifically, the launchers, they were taken out, more than 3/4 or so of each. Much of their defense production capability also destroyed, and their drones. But it wasn't all completely destroyed. So they still maintain a capability. And what we've learned, according to these officials we've spoken with, is during the course of this ceasefire, which now has lasted well longer than the actual major combat operation phase of this war, during the ceasefire, Iran has restarted rebuilding of their defense industrial base to try to start rebuilding more drones, eventually more of their ballistic missiles. And they've been able to dig out and bring out some of their missiles and their launchers and things that were in hardened structures, potentially even if they were hit by the U.S. or Israeli strikes during the course of the war and basically buried. They're able to reconstitute some of those. So it has created this need for the U.S. military to basically build this whole new target list. And what's really critical here, Yaz, is while there are many fewer targets that they would have to go after during this phase, if in fact the president were to restart combat operations, they're more difficult for them to get at.
So I'm curious about this list because the president has been threatening military action as a negotiating tactic, and he goes to extremes at times. In April, he actually threatened that a quote unquote whole civilization is going to die tonight. More recently, he warned that if Iran attacked any American vessels, they will be, quote, blown off the face of the earth, unquote. So how much of this new list is pressure and how much of it is a real threat?
So the president has made it very clear, and many of the people around him, that if in fact they can't come to some sort of a deal, the next step is more strikes. And it's not really clear if they are looking at some kind of a more tailored effort here or if it would be a resumption of widespread major combat operations. The reality is they have to have this kind of planning ready to go should the president, especially a president like Donald Trump, who really changes his mind on a dime on things, they have to have these sort of options ready so that if in fact he were to turn to them. And also, I suspect this is part of the many meetings that they've been having at the White House to discuss this. I'm sure the president says things like, well, what would we be able to hit? Or what would we be able to do? And how long would it take? They have to have those options ready. So it doesn't surprise me this list exists. I think the real question right now that we just don't know the answer to is, will President Trump, does he actually have the appetite to move forward on it and to act on these potential targets? Publicly, he makes it seem like he doesn't, but we just don't know what's going on behind closed doors right now.
What does it tell us about the next phases of this war?
The buildup that has occurred during the ceasefire, Iran, yes, they are reconstituting. The U.S. military has reconstituted, and they've even put themselves in a better position than they were back in February when this war started. They've got more than 200 aircraft that are afloat right now back towards the blockade. So what that gives them that they didn't have back in February is the ability to do what are known as dynamic strikes. So that means that they go out on their target runs and then they see, oh, hey, we see a formation of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. We see a missile that's being loaded on a launcher. We see something that is a dynamic opportunity, and they have close by aircraft right off the coast there, just on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz. They can mobilize, they can move, and then they go in to hit those dynamic strikes. It puts them in a stronger position militarily because of what they have brought in during the ceasefire. And it's not just that, they've also been able to refill air defenses and longer range systems that were really depleted during the first 37 days or so.
Courtney Kube, thank you.
Thanks, Yaz.
So Team USA has a roster for the World Cup out. But if you're looking at this list, I have to be honest here, most of the players are not well known. So I want to bring in NBC News sports editor Greg Rosenstein to talk us through some of the names on this list.
Well, first, I'd like to start by saying this is the, quote, golden generation of the U.S. men's national team. In the last World Cup in 2022, they reached the round of 16 in a bit of a surprising performance because a lot of the players were very young. But there were a lot of these guys who played together, for a long time on the national team and the amateur level. So now they're more experienced. A lot of these guys are playing in Europe, playing for some of the top teams. And so, are they going to win the World Cup? Probably not. There are a lot better teams out there right now. I think they rank 16th.
Way to
by
have
FIFA.
faith, by the way, Greg.
But this is a team that hopefully is going to put on their best performance in years. I will say, if you're going to know one player, I would say it's Christian Pulisic. He's kind of the face of this team. He's a midfielder and a winger for AC Milan, one of the biggest teams in Europe, in Italy right now. He's kind of been like the golden boy, you could say, of the golden generation. And he is going to be the guy that I think a lot of people are keying on to really step up and lead this team deep in the tournament.
My kids are obsessed with the World Cup. And I feel like there is a generation of kids that are coming up that are going to kind of help bring soccer to the main stage here in the United States, which has struggled up until now. Do you feel as if now that the World Cup is here playing on American soil, this is soccer's moment, right, to become as popular here domestically as it is overseas?
I would say this is the time that that's going to happen. I mean, it's a team that actually has a lot of potential, as I just mentioned. They're going to be in all different cities across America. I live in Los Angeles. People are buzzing about the first game against Paraguay at SoFi Stadium. But, the World Cup final is going to be outside New York, in New Jersey. The best of the best are going to be here for basically an entire month. And millions of people are going to tune in. Even within soccer, like if you look at the English Premier League or La Liga or some of these other top leagues in Europe, there's a bunch of games going on at once. It's hard to kind of follow necessarily. You might have one team you follow and that's it. Like, the world is going to be tuned into the World Cup. So I do think, like, for that young American soccer player out there, like, they're going to be watching on TV and saying, like, this is who I want to be. I want to work towards one day being in the World Cup. So I think it could be a real big turning point.
Greg Rosenstein, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, that is going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugan. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever the day may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, press the subscribe button. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.